Hey, welcome back. Yesterday, I read an article about uncovering ancient genealogies from genomic information. And the place they were discovering this ancient genealogy was in something called a long barrow. And I found both very fascinating. And so I thought I'd make a little video about it. So here we go. Long barrows, stone burial structures reveal an ancient human history. So what am I going to talk about? Well, first, what the heck is a long barrow, right? What are they and where are they found? I want to talk a little bit about the carbon-14 dating of something called the Hazelton cairn, which is another name for this long barrow. And that's going to get us a little into establishing the timeline of when this particular ancient family history occurred. And then I want to talk a little bit about the genomes that reveal this family tree. And I'm going to wrap it up with what I traditionally do on this particular channel, which is talk about this in relationship to young Earth creationism, or the worldview of young Earth creationism, whereby the world is only 6,000 years old, and most of the world that you and I know would be 4,500 years or less. And so there's obviously a conflict there between that chronology and the chronology I'm going to present that has been uncovered at this particular long barrow. So let's kick it off by talking about what in the world long barrows are. Oh yeah, I forgot. This is the actual paper that I read, a high resolution picture of kinship practices in an early Neolithic tomb in the prestigious journal Nature. And again, this just came out yesterday, and the key term in here that, of course, caught my eye and made me think we should talk about it is 5,700 years ago, right? So that's a little beyond that 4,500 year range I just talked about. So 5,700 years ago, there is a tomb or tomb structure found in what is modern day England, which contains the remains of family members who died around this time. And in fact, genomic analysis now has demonstrated there are uh, multiple generations of people that are in this particular tomb, and they are connected to each other by family tree. All right, so they've developed a family tree for the individuals living at this particular location. So it's a really interesting snapshot in time of a family or group of families living in a local area in England, presumably 5,700 years ago, but we'll need to look at where that comes from, where that value comes from, the 5,700 years. So, but first, long barrows. Long barrows in Europe in particular, they're all dated by a variety of mechanisms, but mostly by finding organic contents in them. Many of them contain bones of human beings, and those can then be dated by carbon-14 dating and a few other forms of dating as well. And they're all dated between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago. And the green patches on this particular diagram show the locations where these barrows, have been found. There's over 40,000 barrows that have been identified, and it's presumed that many, if not most, have actually been lost to history. Many smaller ones are completely overgrown, or people have just carried the rocks away, not realizing what they were from 5,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago, use them for other purposes, and we have lost these particular archaeological sites to history. Nonetheless, 40,000 different locations where these are found, and yet everywhere they're found, they're only found within this particular time range. And so this seems to be a particular cultural practice of building these structures, which I haven't shown you yet, but they're mostly stone structures that may include some timber to create a roof, and then often covered with soil. And so, but inside there are these chambers, individual rooms, sometimes a large room, but many times subdivided into many separate chambers. And inside of these chambers are often found piles of bones and human bones from individuals of many different ages, sexes, and so there's been a lot of work done to try to understand who these people were and why did they do what they did. And the article I'm going to show you in particular is going to go through one particular long barrow It's going to identify the remains of, I believe it was 35 different individuals that are interned there. And it's going to connect most of them by familial patterns, meaning their relationships to each other by sequencing their genomes. And so they're going to extract DNA from these presumably 5,700-year-old bones, extract DNA and actually sequence their entire genome and be able then to do all the same types of things that you would do if you had your DNA looked at by 23andMe or Ancestry.com or something like that. In fact, they can do much more than that because they have much more DNA than you would have if you had it at 23andMe, which is only looking at little snippets of your genome, not the entire genome. All right, so here's a long barrow from outside Gloucestershire in southwest England, and the one we're going to look at in Hazelton is not too far away from this particular one. This just gives you the idea of the antiquity of these. This just looks like a hump, a hill on the side, but actually it is a very substantial set of, you can see there's a couple people in this picture. It's a very substantial pile of rocks, and not rocks that are natural to that particular exact location. These would have been rocks brought in and then laid on top of each other to form walls and a structure which within was overlaid with soil and then with just an entrance into it. And these can be found all over the hillsides of England, and as you saw, also in Spain and France and a few other places. And so the particular long barrow I was interested in, of course, is the one that was talked about in this Nature article. But in the Nature article, they're only talking about the genomes of these individuals. And so I went back and I looked at some of the history of other things that have been done at this particular site to try to establish the chronology of this particular location prior to them looking at the family history. And the two combined, having carbon-14 dating and other forms of chronology, combined now with looking at family history, makes a really more compelling case about us seeing a snapshot in ancient human history. And so I took a look at this particular article this is from 2070, A Short Passage of Time, the dating of the Hazelton Long Cairn. And it's going to say, the reason it says a short passage of time is because they determined that this particular long barrow was probably only in use in terms of like it being actively used by a community of people living in that particular area for maybe just a couple generations or a little, maybe around 100 years or more. That's not true for all the long barrows. There's some evidence that some long barrows have been used for over 1,000 years, an individual one, maybe intermittently. So maybe used for a while by people in the area, and then eventually maybe lost, not used, abandoned, and then maybe others coming back to that area and then starting to reuse it. And that's determined by the fact that there's physical evidence inside that some of the bones are much older than other ones, and they're stored in different locations, and maybe there's a soil layer, and then there's bones on top of those, suggesting there's some time passed between the two. And now what I'm sure is going to happen after this particular paper came out is they're going to be able to go to all these other different long barrows that still have remains in them, be able to sample the bones from different ones where it's been predicted that there was a long-term use of these sites. And then what I would predict is they're going to be able to show that there are families that are unrelated. Their bones are unrelated, showing that disconnect with how families have moved around the area. Just like we can look at our own family history over the last couple hundred years now using DNA, we can see where portions of our genomes have moved around the world and lived in different locations for different amounts of time. This is going to become more and more true for ancient history as we collect more bones and do the genotyping of them and start to actually form the connections of these people related to these other people living several hundred miles away, or these people were not related to the people living right down the street. at this very same moment in time. And so I think we're going to generate more and more accurate pictures of what life was like. And the particular paper that I read was really talking about what was the community like. Who dominated the community? Was this all people that are related to each other? Are they unrelated individuals coming in and out of community? Are they all related to maybe one individual, showing that this is just a large family? Um, was there inbreeding involved, or did they outbreed with others in other communities? And all those types of questions could be addressed once you get DNA, because the DNA really tells the story of an individual's history. All right, so here's the money image from this particular article on the dating of the Hazelton long barrow, or cairn as they call it. And what I want to point out to you is these are carbon-14 dates, so they've dated a variety of different elements that are found inside of just this one location. All right, so these little black humps right here, that represents the carbon-14 dates and the error bars, the error ranges, not these longer bars. And so the hump represents sort of like, here's where our best estimate from using carbon-14 is. And this is not terribly evident, but if you follow this up right here, this is where you get 3,700-ish, all right? 3,700 BC would be about 5,700 years ago. And that's where they're getting that date from, for 5,700 years. But the critical thing here, the thing I find really fascinating here, is that as they look, you see this says boundary start pre-cairn. You're saying as we dig down at the bottom of this particular long barrow, right? So like, hey, if you were to start to build and you have a foundation, right? If you look at the foundation, you look at the material that's lying right below that foundation, well, that represents the land right before you started to build on it. They found some organic matter there. They dated that, and that hump right there is a little bit older than the ones preceding above it. I don't know if that's, let me just draw a line through these, all right? And as you go through here, what they're saying is all of these up here are elements that are found inside the long barrow that are sort of at layers above. So if you have a chamber and you have a whole bunch of bones at different levels, right, that have been added on. Well, the ones on the top you presume should be probably younger than the ones at the bottom. And that's what the carbon-14 dating shows. As you trace this up, it slightly shifts to the right, and slightly shifting to the right is getting younger, right? And that span of time, if you look at like how much time does this cover from the very beginning of like, hey, they started to build this thing, to like, hey, we don't see anything new being added to this particular location, that particular time is just over 100 years, right? So you only have a 100-year time span in which this very large structure that probably has hundreds of thousands of individual stones in it, but probably built over 100-year period of time. Probably started with one, small area to start to create your, funeral area, or your tomb, and then you just start expanding on that over time. And so the same, and well, to give away the story, it's basically the same family, because almost everybody in this tomb is a relative of just a few people. And so they're all related to one another, except for some of the women. And so it appears that the male lineages are all related to each other at this location, but there's multiple females at this location that are not related by ancestry to the other males there. Now, there are daughters that are found at the location that then show that they are related to the males that are there. But there are some females that it looks like women were brought to that location, or men went out and to another location and found their mate, and then brought them back here. And then when they died, they were laid to rest in this particular location with the males. All right, so hold that in your mind for just a moment. I could try to get through this fairly quickly here. The 100-year thing. Like I said, some other long barrows have much longer histories, But remember, there's also like 40,000 of these things, plus another 40,000 that have been lost to history. So these things are all over the place, and each one kind of probably may represent what this one does here, which is a small community that's probably very highly interrelated to one another, and this is a very personal sort of site for them and burying their dead. I do also want to just, because it's going to become important when I talk about sort of young Earth creationism and their criticisms. You notice that they took a lot of carbon-14 dates from a lot of different items inside of the site, and they're fairly consistent in terms of being within this 100-year time frame. If carbon-14 dating were just completely erroneous and random, you obviously wouldn't get this kind of aligning. So what young Earth creation has to do, because they don't believe these dates, right? They say they can't be older than say 4,000 years old, as I'll show you why in a moment. I'll just say it right now. It's because they don't believe that anyone would have gotten to England until about 4,000 years after departing the Ark, right? So Noah's Ark, 4,500 years, then Tower of Babel, and then young Earth creationists say they dispersed across the world at that point. So probably getting to England like 4,000 years old. So this is 1,700 years too old, these dates. So the carbon-14 is a real thing, and they'd have to explain it, and they're just going to say that all the dates are wrong and they all should be shifted over several thousand years. But the dates are very consistent, and they do show this window of about 100 years, which becomes relevant when I talk about this paper. So along in just today, actually yesterday, comes this paper, a high resolution picture of kinship. And so they took a look at intergenerational. Well, let's just go right to the important image. And I'm not going to go through all this family tree stuff, other than say that you should know, if you've never looked at family trees before, circles are females and squares are males. And so they have a whole series of individuals, and all these individuals are found, all the ones of color are found inside of this location. And by looking at their genomes and looking at their genetics, they can see that some are very closely related to each other, right? They know what brother and sister are, and they can tell what cousins are and second cousins. So they have this high degree of relationship among one another. The other thing they showed was that at least one male progenitor produced with 4 different women. And so they have descendants. They can't tell that just from the women themselves, right? They have the male, and then they have a bunch of different offspring from that male. They can tell are offspring, direct offspring of that male. And then when they look at their genomes, they see that if they were all descendants of the same male and female, they should have, right, the same genetic information from the male and the female. But what happens is they have the same genetic information from one male, but they have 4 different pieces of genetic information from 4 different females, of which at least, I think it was at least 3 of those don't seem to be related at all to anyone in that particular location, meaning those 3 females came from somewhere else. And so in this way, they're able to infer something about the relationships and the type of culture that is going on at this particular location. Now, in the end, what they discover is that there's at least 4 different generations in this one location, and those 4 generations are related to each other. So that shows, again, you can use the genetics to show that people lived at this particular location. They had children at that location. Those children stayed in that location, at least some of them did, and then raised another family in that particular location, and then they had children at that particular location. So they're saying 4 and possibly 5 generations of individuals living all in the same location, probably very small location. Now, there are other long barrows that are not very far away from this particular location. So what will be interesting is to look at the genetics there and see, is there any relationship between the individuals at those 2 locations, or were they truly isolated from one another? And so that's going to be something that will come out in the next few years. But they're building this sort of genealogy, from thousands of years ago through ancient DNA samples. And then the other thing I wanted to show you from this paper is this figure here, figure 9, actually just 9A, which is on the left-hand side. And so the triangles represent individual samples. So I don't want to, okay, this is principal component analysis, but this figure over here is basically mapping out the genetic variation. Um, and I don't want to, yeah, I'm not going to explain how that happens. I'll just say that each dot on here represents an individual. All these gray dots are showing present day people and their genetic relationships to each other. So the closer you are together, the more genetically similar you are. So if I was here and somebody else is here, that means we're genetically very similar to one another, right? And so you can see there's kind of groupings, right? And these groupings represent various groupings of where families and groups of individuals have lived for long periods of time and they are related to one another. So down here, all these triangles represent the Hazleton site, right? So all these Hazleton, all the individuals in that particular location are all fairly similar to one another. Now I said they weren't all direct relatives of one another. Some of them, like some of these women, were from somewhere else. They're just not. They're not. They're more than like fourth cousins away. But nonetheless, they still fit within this general, I'll call it a genetic landscape here. And then if we go down and we look at England Neolithic, Scotland Neolithic, Ireland Neolithic, these dots, which are all inside of here as well, they're in this side of the larger space here. All the other ancient DNAs that are also dated to similar ages, in other words, the Neolithic, which is said to be from 8,000 to 4,500 years ago, all the samples from that particular period, carbon-14 dated to that particular period, genetically are all generally in the same, same grouping, as if like basically what you're saying is all the people in England or Great Britain today, right, including Ireland, what probably offended Irish there, and all the people on those islands. Okay, let's put it that way, all the peoples there probably represented a single people group that had migrated there and then spread out over that particular area over a period of a couple thousand years and built thousands of these long barrows. And so each representing different family units, but still nonetheless all having a relationship to one another. Now, what's interesting is that when you get to the Bronze Age, where am I at here? Here we go. When you get to the Bronze Age, which is 4,500 years ago, 2,800 years ago, and you look at England, Scotland, Ireland, you'll see where all of those samples are, right? They're in a very different genetic landscape, all right? Different area in the genetic landscape. That suggests, what has been suggested is that essentially all the people that were there in the Neolithic went extinct, right? They were killed off, something happened to them, they disappeared, and then they were replaced by another wave of immigration of individuals that coming in from another area of Europe. And then they populated the entire set of islands themselves, and they're all fairly closely related. And people that live there today, all right, a lot of people that live there today are also related to those people. So their genetic lineage has carried on. But the genetic lineages of the Neolithic members, they don't seem to exist today. Right, that genetic lineage is not connected to the islands of those there that are there today. And so this is interesting as well. All right, so just final thoughts here. Ancient history or much younger, oh, I should say younger than thought. So 5,700 years old by carbon-14 dating is 1,200 years older than the proposed date of the Noah's flood. So that's incompatible with young Earth creationism. Consider also that the long barrows sit on ice age deposits that, according to young Earth creationists, are only 4,000 years old. Right? All this land where these long barrows are found are sitting on deposits that even young Earth creationists say were probably created by an ice age, and they would say that ice age happened after Noah's flood. Several hundred years after Noah's flood, you have this massive ice age, which affected all of the British Isles. And In fact, most of the rocks that they're being used to make these particular long barrows are probably the remnants of broken up rock from great amounts of ice sitting on top of them and scraping the land off. All right, so that very much limits the young Earth creationists to when they're going to like they got to pack all these thousands of long barrows, each of which you have to imagine took 100 years to make or more. Some of them are very large. The one we're talking about actually isn't nearly the largest. Um, and here, what we're seeing now is we're seeing evidence that people lived at these locations for 100 years or more, right? So that takes up time, right? In your chronology, you have to fit that family history in there. And then the other cairns around them are carbon 14 dated to some of them 500 years later or 300 years before. And so you start looking at the carbon 14 dating picture, you start to see, no, these long barrows are spread out over 1500 years. And each one of them probably represents snapshots of several hundred years of use and then abandoning that. And what I kind of view as like, as you migrate in, you have families or a couple families that move in. They're then setting up shop, right? Setting up a community that then begins to form this long barrow as their funeral practice, which we don't know anything about, but obviously some kind of burial site. And as the family grows, right, and they have more and more offspring, some of those offspring then are eventually going to have to peel off and move to new locations and start to spread out across that land, right? That might take 100 years to get to the point where now there's enough individuals that they're starting their own long barrow. And then that community then needs to grow to the point where it's going to break off and form another community, maybe 15 miles away, and now they're going to start producing their own long barrow. So it totally makes sense that the long barrows are not all the same age. Now, in the young Earth creationist chronology, they virtually have to be the same age in order to fit them all in, because all these have to be fit in. And then you have to have the disappearance of all these people because their genetics just disappear, along with the ability then to make the long barrows. The long barrows just cease to exist in terms of new ones being made. There's nothing dated after around 5,000 years ago. After that, it's like there's different technologies, and no one made long barrows again. Now, other people, there's some evidence they reused long barrows, but for other purposes. It's like, oh, here's a pile of rocks and it's got some chambers in it. Let's store some food. They probably had no idea, didn't know anything about those people, because the people who made them don't seem to have existed at the time which anyone later who came along, right? So you have to fit in this entire new migration and resettlement of the British Isles in this young Earth creationist world. And yet all that has to happen a long time ago still, because you've had people living there for thousands of years in a very modern sort of environment with other technologies that are on top of these. So this is where I'm saying the carbon 14 datings revealing that about 100 years at least of occupation of the Hazelton Long Barrow was really interesting, because that data came from 2007. And then somebody looked at the bones, and then what they found out was the bones only represent 4 or 5 generations of individuals. And if you think about 4 or 5 generations, how long do you think 4 or 5 generations would take place? Well, if you have kids at about 20 years old, they might have been younger, but let's say 20 years old, 5 generations, that's 100 years, right? Yeah, so that's 100 years to generate 5 generations of of genealogy at that particular location. And the C14 dating suggests that that was it. They started it. There was about several generations of individuals that must have lived there, and then 100 years later, boom, it was done. There wasn't any more activity at that particular location. That fits very, very well with the genealogical evidence that we found later. So another reason to suggest that the carbon 14 dating is actually quite an accurate system of dating things. Yeah, so I think I just said that family history and genomes is consistent with C14 evidence. And I also want to reiterate that other long barrows record over 1,000 years of intermittent use. And I think we're going to have a lot more evidence of that in the future. We have evidence from carbon 14 dating, of intermittent use, right? You have sections where you have additions and you see that carbon-14 dating, showing maybe 100, 200 years of use. And then you have a huge gap, and then 500 years later, you suddenly have more use of it later. That also makes intuitive sense in terms of just community structure and, hey, I'm sure there were wars and I'm sure there were marauding bandits that killed off people, and they're probably very small. The other thing from this genealogical stuff is these are probably small groups of people, right? So this is maybe 20 or 30 people living in this area, maybe at most 100, but certainly not many more than that. And even if it was 100, that meant that most of them didn't get buried in the long barrow. So maybe it was only for privileged people. But if any good percentage of individuals were actually buried in the long barrow, then these communities were very small and persisted. And you might have to imagine that if you're a very small community, your persistence over 100 years is pretty good, right? Lots of them probably didn't persist for that long, and that's why you would have intermittent use. You would have community dies out, is dragged away, something terrible happens to them. There's drought in the area, and they just move away, right? They abandon it, and then later on, the more individuals move into that area. And here's my prediction: they're going to look at other sites. They're going to do this genealogical analysis, and they're going to find out here's 100 years, here's 3 generations that live there. Then the carbon-14 dating suggests there was a 75-year gap. The individuals that then started to get deposited after that are completely unrelated to those other individuals. So it's a different family, it's a different group that comes back in and reuses that particular site. All of these things together, when you put the whole picture together and you just think the descriptions in these papers very much fit just what is intuitive about how these sites would grow, how people would live there, how they would use them. And they also fit the physical evidence of these being very old sites. They're not just a couple thousand years old. Many of them are highly worn down. They're eroded, and they were eroded long before modern people that we think of as living in the British Isles came to actually come there. Probably lived on these particular sites, not even knowing that they were historical archaeological sites. And so all of this oozes a human history that reaches beyond 4,000 years, that it goes back 7, 8, 9,000 years into time. So this is really a big challenge for young Earth creationists to explain places like these long barrows that we find in England. So thanks a lot for listening. Again, I just found that an interesting paper, and I look forward to finding out more about these particular sites. And if something else interesting comes up, I'll probably tag something, add something onto this video at another time. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.